Hey there. Before we get the podcast started, I just wanted to let you know that I'm licensed for real estate in Rhode Island and New Hampshire. In New Hampshire, I'm part of the number one team in the state, and in Rhode Island, I'm at the top 20% of my brokerage. So if you're interested in buying or selling and are looking for a balance of negotiation prowess and working with somebody that actually cares about you, I'm your guy. Call me 401-487-4477, or you can look at my website, maxwillett.kw.com or max.thedowgroup.com. Thanks, guys, and enjoy the episode. Knowledge is Power is where you come to hear people's life experiences to learn from. So, without further ado, let's roll the intro.
Stay hungry, stay foolish.
We choose to go to the moon in this decade and do the other thing, not because they are easy, but because they are hard.
I have a dream. Will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character.
Hello and welcome back to the Knowledge is Power podcast. This is your host, Max Willett, and we got a really interesting interview today. I'm really excited about it. Something I guess we're going to be dwelling into a few different controversial things eventually, but this is a gentleman that has a really, really interesting story, and I'd love to hear it. So if you could go ahead and introduce yourself, that would be great.
Sure. Good afternoon, good morning, whenever you're listening to this podcast. My name's Ken Block. I've been kicking around Rhode Island for close to 30 years. Never really, I'm a businessman. I own a software engineering company that used to be headquartered in Warwick. And then when COVID came around, everyone who worked for me liked working from home and said I could ditch the office, which I happily did, saved a bunch of money in the process. I've lived in Barrington for most of the 30 years I've been here in Rhode Island. Got married here, raised my two kids here. They're both in college now. Dabbled around in politics for the last 10 to 15 years, statewide politics. Two-time candidate for governor. I ran in 2010 as the candidate for a new political party that I created in the state called the Moderate Party. It's a whole story involved in that. And then in 2014, I gave it another shot running as a Republican. I lost my primary by about 3,000 votes, and voter fraud was not to blame. We'll get to that later on, I'm pretty sure. My company specializes in really large database applications. We built and delivered the very first statewide food stamp program to the state of Texas in the mid-1990s. We have done those same systems for the government of Puerto Rico, state of California, state of Illinois. We do lots of work with the lottery industry around the world. And we also happen to specialize in elections and election data. And that specialization got me into some interesting situations over the last couple of years that I'm sure we'll be talking about at some point.
Yeah, absolutely. I feel like that's a really simplified version of your story, and I think there's a lot to unpack there. But let's start off, with your beginnings. How did you see yourself sort of starting your own business? Did you go to college? Did you realize it during college, or was it sort of after college?
Yeah. So I went to Dartmouth College, graduated in 1987. I majored in computer science and I minored in government.
Okay.
I, through no direct plan, sort of figured out a way to blend the two of those interests together, and have made an excellent living at it over the years. I came out of college when I graduated, interviewed both on Wall Street and with a very little known company at the time on the West Coast called Microsoft. They wanted to hire me. I didn't want to move out west to a company I had never heard of before. I would have been about employee 300 had I done it.
Wow.
And had it gone down that way, I probably wouldn't be talking to you right now. I specialized in databases from the very beginning. That's why Microsoft wanted to hire me way back in the day. And I've used my expertise in databases as a full-time employee in the banking industry, investment banking, commercial banking. Within 4 years of graduation, I had moved to consulting. I worked for a small consultancy outside of Boston. Left there by happenstance, got a contracting job with the big lottery company whose name at the time was GTech uh, here in Rhode Island. And I came down for a 1 year consulting gig and basically never left. Uh, After coming down, when I as a 23, 24-year old, when I was doing that, I was lived in Newport for the year and was commuting out to Coventry, and just having a spectacular time at everything. Loved Rhode Island, loved the pretty much everything about it, and ended up buying a house on the East Bay and stuck around. It wasn't something that I planned on. GTech ended up convincing me to go full time for a full year. So for a few years, I did become a full time employee. Realized that it was far more lucrative for me to be not a full time employee. Went back to contracting. GTech asked me to form a company to take over the food stamp work, which was a project I helped quarterback for them. And it was that ask on the part of GTech and the work that we did as a prime government contractor to Texas, Puerto Rico, et cetera, which really launched me on the path to business ownership and a company whose numbers at times gotten as high as 40, 45 people. And Yeah, I'd love to be able to say to you, it was all a carefully planned thing, but it wasn't. It was something that opportunities arose and I took advantage of them when I could.
Right. The last podcast did the advice at the end of the podcast that he gave was, don't have regrets, just don't ever ask yourself the question, what if I did that? That definitely sort of falls in line with that advice that he gave. Um, so explain to me, how were you feeling when you were making this transition into, being fully time self-employed, and was there any sort of wariness that came into place, or did you feel pretty confident because you were already connected with a pretty large company?
So I was the decision to jump into consulting was an easy one. I was doing it very effectively as the full-time employee of a company that contracted me out to their
Hmm.
clients. I was being placed in the position of
Right.
parachuting into a business and operating as the expert. So I knew I could do it. And whether I did it under the auspices of somebody else or if I did it under my own banner, there wasn't much difference there.
Right.
Uh, it was incredibly lucrative. What I was doing was in very high demand. So I wasn't worried about stability. I wasn't worried about paying the bills. Uh, I was single. I had bought a home, and I bought the home at a time when the prices were quite depressed. This was right after, in the early 90s, Rhode Island had a big real estate spasm when the credit unions collectively went under, and it ruined the housing market. I was a sole earner with a high income and was able to use that to my great advantage. I ended up buying waterfront in Barrington for under $200,000. So yeah, it worked out well, and situationally, everything was lined up for that transition to be easy for me, risk free for me, and ultimately, it worked out quite well.
Yeah, wow. I would say that's so, you mentioned your college background, and you sort of took advantage of a situation that arose, but did you have any previous interest in this sort of industry, or was it just sort of spur of the moment opportunity that came up?
Uh, while I was consulting out of Boston, I had done work for big telecommunications companies. I had done for work for banks. I had done work for other technology companies. I didn't come to Rhode Island looking to do work for the lottery industry.
Hmm.
I came to Rhode Island because I was offered a contracting job for a company that happened to be the lottery industry at that time. Uh, so for me, it was more about the actual work I was doing as opposed to a specific industry. It has worked out quite well for me that I did work for GTech and in as both a full-time employee and as a consultant for decades. We've had a good, close relationship over the years, and it's worked out to both of our benefits. And as you build expertise in an industry, whether you do it accidentally or on purpose, uh, you're not a particularly good business minded person if you don't make use of that expertise and use it to move forward. And that's what I did with my consulting firm and with the work that we've been doing for the last 30 years.
Yeah. So could you sort of explain how you modernize the lottery systems and how you sort of, I don't know, like brought the technology to life and made it, I don't know, more accessible. I'm really I'm
Yeah,
trying to understand like what you did.
yeah. So again, my expertise was in a specific piece of technology called relational databases.
Hmm.
Uh, for anyone who knows a little bit about technology, you might now know about a database called SQL Server, which is a Microsoft product. You might have heard of Oracle, et cetera, et cetera. When I first came to Rhode Island and started working for GTech, uh, they weren't using relational databases in any of their systems. They and many other companies were doing things much differently, using tools that were a lot cruder. And I was brought down specifically to help them adapt to using commercial databases and helping them make that jump, which is what I did for them for the better part of a decade, help them upgrade their systems, move into the technology, and then assisted them with their projects that relied upon these databases and helped them implement them and brought a team of engineers to the table to help them deliver customers to their systems all over to their deliver their systems to their customers all over the world.
Okay. So what was the biggest advancement like within the technology where you saw the difference at the consumer level? Like you're buying a lottery ticket. Was there any difference there, or was it just basically all on the back end?
It's all the back end.
Okay.
And you realize efficiencies. You're able to build the systems faster. The systems, if they're built correctly, function much better, much more dependably, uh, and your speed to delivery increases dramatically. So it's all back end technological. Most of the innovations in the lottery industry, in fact, most of the innovations in a great many industries, uh, there's a lot more invisible change that happens from the perspective of the customer or the user who's interfacing with these systems or using them. I'd say it breaks down about 70-30. 70% of the changes are never perceived by the end users, and it's more about the back end functionality and the architecture of the system. That's where the bulk of the work happens.
Okay. So let me ask you this. Like the lottery, I don't know, system seems to be pretty simple. You go, you buy a ticket, that money goes to the bank account that whatever the bank account is, all these people buy it, and then there's a payout to that person who wins the lottery. So why did they need to streamline the back end systems? Like why was that necessary?
So without getting into the painful technical details, the way those systems worked and the technologies they used to implement the lotteries used programming languages that ended up eventually becoming defunct, used computer hardware that eventually became defunct. At the time, they were using digital equipment computers, DEC. They no longer exist. You cannot at your peril would you create a system, never update the back end, and just try to keep that using that forever. uh the A generation in the technological world is about 5 years. So once your system is 5 years of age, the technologies on which you built that are no longer state of the art.
Hmm.
So there's a natural need to upgrade, refresh, and adapt virtually all of the components that make up your computer system. And the lottery systems are substantially more complex than what you just described. I mean, instant tickets alone is a whole universe of complexity. Those scratch off tickets, making sure the tickets show up at the place where you buy them, making sure you can pay the winners correctly, and accounting for the different denominations, the different games, when those games expire. There's an awful lot that goes in to the conduct of a lottery. And on the lotto and Powerball and that those kinds of games, uh, you can't you if you lose track of having sold the winning Powerball ticket, right? If that ticket is transacted at the gas station and for some reason doesn't get recorded in the database, you have a monumental problem, and you have just for the lottery vendor, you've incurred massive liability for having lost potentially $1 billion lottery ticket. So
Okay.
there's a ton of technology that goes into ensuring that when somebody buys that any ticket, let alone the $1 billion ticket, that it's correctly recorded and there's no possibility of it either getting lost or worse, corrupted somehow so that you can't find it again. So yeah, there's an awful lot that goes into it, but we see in state governments they don't follow the 5 year rule on technologies, and we still have systems in Rhode Island government that were programmed on computers that are now 30 to 40 years old in programming
I
languages
believe
that
it.
nobody learns anymore.
Yeah.
And the only people who can support them and work on them are all in their 70s, right? So there's a overarching compelling reason to remain state of the art. I mean, just think about your cell phone. Anybody who has a cell phone that's more than 5 years old, you find that you almost can't use it. You certainly can't put new software on it, and it's susceptible to all kinds of security problems that the newer phones aren't. So there is a very necessary reason to upgrade and update all aspects of technology systems with regularity to remain state of the art.
Okay. Can you sort of explain the story and what you did, like from when you first started and then sort of into modern times, like how it started and the advancements you guys have made over the years from that first time you started integrating these new systems?
Uh, yeah, I can't get too deep into talking about the technologies that and what we specifically did for my customer
Okay.
because I'm not authorized to do that.
Right.
I
Okay.
can talk in generalities, but I can't talk in specifics.
Okay.
Uh, but we help them completely re-architect their systems from the generation of software and hardware that was in place when we got there to integrating the first one or two generations of commercial databases, huge projects, lots of work, lots of existing customers that had to be retrofitted down the line. We then did the second generation of updates and built the food stand system for them at the same time during this time period. And we worked on just about all of the different areas of gaming that GTech supported, including casinos. And I was personally involved in the design, implementation, and the creation of the casinos here in Rhode Island. At the time, it was called Lincoln Greyhound Park and Newport Highlight. Was involved in all elements of that, and I even helped wheel the first slot machines out of the trucks and
Huh.
into the casinos, which were not casinos at that point in time. They were literally a grandstand where they just put the slot machines into a weather protected area. So yeah, I've done lots of work in the with state based and state sponsored casinos like we have here, and I've done some commercial casino work as well.
Okay. So that's interesting. So the work you're in, there's a parallel between the lottery, food stamps, and casinos. Can you
Yeah,
explain how those systems sort of parallel with each other and integrate and why you're able to do those three pretty different things? I mean, the lottery and the casino pretty similar, but food stamps is sort of the one that stands out. Like, what's the
yeah.
similarities there?
So the similarity, there isn't one from a high level application look at it. Although handling food stamp transactions, high volume thing, and for the state of Texas, they had 60,000 point of sale devices, and every time somebody who was receiving benefits purchased food, they did so on their card. So we processed, I think, $100 billion a year in benefits. That's a whole lot of transactions, and
Yeah.
GTEC's system was designed to process lots and lots of transactions quickly. So you sell lots of lottery transactions, and the decision they made, the business decision, was to apply their technologies and try to expand what they did into a different line of work that had a different set of high volume transactions, and that's what the food stamp program.
Okay, interesting. Was there any one that was more difficult than the other, or were they all sort of a similar difficulty?
Well, the food stamps was more difficult for GTEC than the lottery because they were experts in the lottery
Hmm.
industry, and they had to cut their teeth in the food stamp industry. So the first project, all first projects are painful. That first project was difficult. There was a big learning curve, and there are all manner of rules and regulations that apply to food stamp processing that don't exist in the lottery world, right? You're dealing with
Hmm.
different federal government entities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So while there are similarities in terms of a network of terminals that source the transactions, the telecommunications infrastructure to move those transactions from the terminals to the main computer, storing the data on the main computer. Those were all core competencies of the lottery company, but all of the rest of it in terms of the business rules for the transactions, the tools that the users need to administer those transactions, the accounting that you have to do for the food stamp world, which is dramatically different than the accounting in the lottery world. There was a lot of business logic that had to be developed for the first time, and that was the big challenge for them.
Okay. In your bio on your website, you talked about how there was waste and fraud in those programs. So what were sort of the things you did to find the fraud and waste and fix those problems and, get rid of it?
Sure. So this was literally the first electronic food stamp system in the country. Before this system went into the state of Texas, every state handed out paper coupons, literally food stamp coupons, to people who were on benefits. They would get mailed out, dropped in people's mailboxes. They would get stolen, and they were bearer instruments. And what that means is whoever held it could redeem it. Uh, and so there was theft from the mails there because this was really pre-computerization, essentially, right? The early 1990s, in state government in particular, you still didn't have widespread competent adoption of technology. Actually, I'd argue a lot. You still don't in some states now.
Hmm.
But what happened was there were lots of people receiving benefits who weren't eligible for those benefits. Uh, there were people who were getting duplicate benefits because they didn't have their technical act together well enough to have clamped down on that sort of thing. There are rules for who is eligible in a paper-based system. Enforcing those rules could be extremely difficult. And so what we did when we brought this system in, and as we worked with the state officials who administered the program, we began to talk about the different tools we could bring to the table to look for qualification problems, to look for duplication of benefits, to solve the problem of benefits being stolen, benefits being redeemed in improper ways, benefits being sold for 50 cents on the dollar. These food stamp benefits are unique in that they're supposed to strictly be spent to acquire food for families in need. And they're not supposed to be spent for any other purpose. And it's a critically important benefit. So when that benefit is being sold for pennies on the dollar to convert it into drugs, tobacco, or alcohol, you're not getting the important social benefit that you're needed to be getting from that from these dollars, and it's missing its intended purpose. So as we did this work and as we tightened everything up and we began to break down and eliminate literal cartels of criminals who are trafficking in food stamps, who had set up elaborate mechanisms to defraud the state government of these funds, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, we helped save and recover more than $1 billion from that program. So it was very successful. It was very important. And the state of Texas led the way. And I think within 6 or 7 years of that first system, every state had an electronic food stamp system.
What was it like working with a state government on such a sensitive issue? Because obviously you've alluded to how slow or how untechnological some states are. What was it like working with them directly and fixing this problem?
I've worked with a lot of state governments over the years, and you can't generalize. And it's also not just state government. It depends what department and what area in state government you're talking about, because while you can have very competent individuals in one program, you may not in another. All governments are highly bureaucratic. Decision making is often slow and disconnected from reality to some extent. Government contracting is extremely difficult, is generally speaking somewhat corrupt in my experience, and frustrating. And but it's if you have a business that can compete in that space, the contracts, if you can win them, are worth all of that, because it's if you're providing a crucial service and the size of the contracts are sufficient, there's lots of revenue to be had by working and competing in this space. So you need people on your staff who understand how to deal with bureaucracies, have the patience of saints in dealing with slow plotting organizations where that has to happen. You need the right people in the right places to ensure you can make it happen correctly.
Yeah, yeah. So what do you think the biggest lesson you've learned from working with all these different types of states and people?
I don't have a single lesson. I mean, patience is a lot more than a virtue from a business owner's perspective. So if you're in this space, if you're working, well, it's not even really with governments. I mean, I contract to some extremely large companies and have contracted to many large companies over the years. Bureaucracies, by and large, are inefficient and sloppy and slow at times to make decisions, and they don't sometimes make the right decisions. It's just you have to recognize that, and you have to deal with the environment in which you're operating, and that requires being open-minded, and requires being self-aware as you work down those lines. I mean, I don't like the corporate politics that most large bureaucracies require. That's one of the reasons I'm much happier as an outside consultant to those organizations, as opposing to being employed by and needing to operate within the reporting structures in those large companies. I'm way better on the outside looking in than on the inside looking out. And that's just my personally being aware of what I can tolerate and what I can't. So, I'm typically brought in when a change agent is necessary. That's what I'm really good at. And ironically, a lot of large bureaucracies don't tolerate change agents from within. They prefer their change agents to come from exterior. And that's usually where I'm positioned. And that's where I'm happier personally.
Hmm. Would you say that there's a stark contrast between a lot of the governments you've worked with and larger companies, or in the way they operate? Or would you say that mostly the companies are a lot more efficient than the governments, or vice versa?
Um, Depends on the company. Yeah,
Yeah.
you can't. It's really hard to generalize, right? I mean,
Yeah.
and it's even hard to pick a state and attempt to generalize all the different departments of the state because they're not the same. They take on the characteristics of a department of one specific department of state are groomed by the people in charge of that department, and as the and so and I'm making this up. I'm not using this. I'm using this as a hypothetical as opposed to experience. The Rhode Island Department of Motor Vehicles versus the Rhode Island Department of Transportation are two completely different departments of state. They have very different missions. They have very different systems. They have very different human resources perspectives. The very nature of how they're managed is extraordinarily different. So you really can't even compare different departments of state and talk generically about them, right? You can maybe compare them, but when their missions are so different and potentially the educational levels of their employees are dramatically different depending on what
Hmm.
services they provide, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. They all have different challenges and different missions and require different expertise, different management styles, et cetera, et cetera. I can speak generally speaking about technology and say that most, but not all, departments of state are behind the times when it comes to technology, and they're reliant upon their vendors because they often don't have the on staff expertise. And that makes some sense because, state governments are not where you see a lot of innovation when it comes to technology. The innovation comes from external companies, and that's where your best technical talent is drawn to because they want to work on innovative things. They want to be challenged, that kind of thing. And what you have within state government are technically oriented people who are not necessarily the innovators, change agent types. And now you're sort of in a challenging situation of trying to discuss things that might be uncomfortable for the entrenched bureaucracy, which is change, and trying to make sure that you're able to communicate what could be a very technical conversation to an audience that may not be nearly technical enough to understand everything.
Hmm. Okay, great. So I think I mean, if you're up to it, we should transition into your political career and your interest in politics. So can you explain the shift to politics, how you decided to go from this tech industry and sort of pursue a political career?
Well, I never left the tech industry.
Okay.
Uh, I didn't plan on entering politics at all. Uh, as a business owner, in the late 2000s, I became really frustrated at the fact that I could, as a resident of Barrington, who lives about 2 miles from the Mass border, at that time in 2006, 7, and 8, had I moved my home 2 miles, and had I moved my business 10 miles, I could have saved many tens of thousands of dollars of tax, many, many tens of thousands of dollars of tax by moving a couple of miles. And that was because Rhode Island had become a higher tax, higher cost state to do business than Massachusetts. I found that very frustrating. I thought that that was killing us, and it was at the time. And you still don't see a lot of businesses flocking to our state, and that's because we've lost our critical mass. We don't have a strong cluster in any industry here anymore. That's a different problem altogether. But this is what drove me into politics, and I looked at the time at what was happening, and I hated the culture wars. I hated the fact that there was what I believed to be hyperpartisanship back in the late 2000s, ineffective governance. We weren't getting the job done, and I felt that the best solution to this was that there should be a new party. We needed a party that was just focused in on the quality of life issues, wasn't focused on the culture war issues, the social issues, and get to the business of governing and just make things better, basically. So I got it in my head to start the moderate party. A former attorney general here by the name of Arlene Violet agreed with me and helped me lay the groundwork to do it. We quickly realized that, actually, I realized that the state laws governing how you create a party were constructed in a way as to make it absolutely impossible to successfully launch a new political party. The state laws made it impossible to do. And I brought it to the former attorney general and I said, Arlene, what do you make of this? She goes, yeah, you're right. Let's go see the ACLU. We went to the ACLU. They took on my cause. They introduced me to the lawyer that they brought on board to go after the state for this. And the bottom line is we sued the state in federal court on constitutional grounds, and we won. We were right.
Wow.
We got the laws changed that provided the possibility of successfully attempting to jump through all the hoops to create the party. We did. We collected 35,000 signatures in 7 weeks. And that's how we ballot qualified the party. We then started looking for a gubernatorial candidate to represent the party. Because once you qualify by signatures, the only way you keep your party status is you need to have a gubernatorial candidate who gets at least 5% of the vote. And we looked and we looked and we looked and we weren't successful. And in February of 2010, 9 months from the election, the executive board of the party turned to me and said, guess what? You're going to run for governor. So that was how I entered politics. I was not on my radar. I did it with a specific goal and purpose in mind, which was to do something that is incredibly difficult to do as a complete unknown with no name recognition in the state of Rhode Island, go from 0 to 5% of the vote. And in that race in 2010, there was Lincoln Chafee, who eventually became the governor. There was Frank Caprio, who was a well-known candidate, Frank Caprio, a Democrat, and John Robitaille, who also entered the race as a complete unknown, but he was running as a Republican. And party politics means, in Rhode Island that you can be a Republican who never gets out of bed, and you're going to get 35% of the vote. That's basically, the default Republican vote. The default Democrat vote is in the mid 40s, basically. And what's left are the voters you have to try and convince to vote one way or the other. So we had about 40 debates over the course of that campaign. It was great. It was well argued. I did very well at the debates. And when all the votes were counted, I got 6.5% of the vote.
Wow.
Which was overperformance. Nobody expected it to be successful, and I realized that I was good at it, that I could communicate my ideas, and I had a lot of ideas about how the function of government could be improved. And I wanted to do it again. What I realized, having created the party, was that nobody got it. I actually probably could have done even better as a candidate had I not done it under a third party. People don't get it. People never understood what the moderate party represented. They think any third party is nuts, that there's got to be kooks who are running under the banner. And the system itself, Republicans and Democrats vote and approve on the rules on how we conduct elections, and they cooperate to make life really hard for anybody who's not a Republican or a Democrat. So there's a lot of reasons why third parties don't take root in our country. And we did try to recruit and run candidates in 2012. We had a couple of Fruit Loop candidates who did decide to run as moderates, which didn't help things. And at the end of the day, I abandoned it and decided to run for governor a second time as a Republican. And I had a really close primary with Alan Fung, and I lost by the statewide primary. I lost by about 3,000 votes.
Interesting. Why did you feel like you did all this work to create a third party and then run as a Republican? Why did you decide to make that jump and not try to ride out on it until maybe you got more support or something happened?
It wasn't going to happen. There is a built-in overcoming the challenges that third parties have in the minds of Americans. I ran a principled race in 2010 with the goal of trying to qualify the party. In 2014, I wanted to win the governorship. I wasn't going to win the governorship running under the banner of a political party that people didn't get.
What did you feel like the most effective strategy was to appeal to moderate candidates, right? When you first ran, what did you do to get the vote and appeal to people?
So, I mean, my platform was the five E's, and you're going to ask me what they are now. I mean, it was economics, environment, education, economy. No, same thing. Economics, economy. I'd have to go back and figure out what the other E's were, but
Okay.
they were quality of life issues. They were a focus on the things that we need from government, and that government needs to provide to us in a acceptable way and an affordable way. There weren't the social issues; they weren't part of it. I avoided it at all costs, and it was about displaying an ability to understand and follow through on things that I was talking about, right? I'm a doer. I was proven in industry. I was proven on managing groups of people, interacting with bureaucracies. And, we still don't really, in fact, our technology projects have been disastrous in this state. We spent $500 million on the upgrade of the Medicare Medicaid system, which was called UHIP, and it was a technical disaster. It was supposed to be $100 million project. It bloated to $500 million. The rollout was disastrous. There were lawsuits against the vendor, et cetera, right? And this is the danger of a government procuring over their abilities to manage it and understand it. That's what happened in that scenario. If you fast forward to today and you look at the failed Washington Bridge here on the East Providence side of things, I mean, I have been absolutely horrified that the failure of the bridge was a surprise to the Department of Transportation. They did not proactively know that the bridge was about to fail. That's a disaster. That is a failure of government. And since they closed that span on an emergency basis, and what we learned about that bridge was that the deck of the bridge with the cement and the asphalt that sits on the top of the bridge was disconnected from the cement underneath it. It was bouncing up and down and wasn't connected. That whole thing could have bounced right off the bridge and into the river. That's why they closed it so quickly on an emergency basis. And what's happened since the day they closed that bridge has been a prime example of government deflection, government non-transparency, no accountability, right? And worse, from a procurement standpoint, they put out a nationwide offer for companies to bid to rebuild the bridge. that no company in the country responded to, right? That doesn't happen. And
No.
it did. And that is testament to just how poorly the DOT put that proposal together, the request for proposals. And since all of that, the state is now suing pretty much every vendor who helps with the construction of bridges in our state.
Yeah.
So, how many companies are going to willingly get themselves wrapped up in an agency that's conducting itself the way that Rhode Island's Department of Transportation is? So, there are tremendous governmental challenges that face us. We have lopsided elections. The Republican Party is moving further from offering voters what they really need and want from their government here in this state of Rhode Island. And we have an entrenched political machine that isn't really paying all that much attention to the important things and is keeping their special interests happy, which keeps them in their elected offices. But for the rest of us, it makes life increasingly uncomfortable.
Yeah. I'm curious to hear, since you started a moderate party and the second time you ran, you wanted to win, right? You wanted to be the governor of Rhode Island. And obviously Rhode Island it's an incredibly left-leaning state now. It's very blue. And you've said that yourself. So why didn't you run as a Democrat? Was it because, and I mean, and
Well,
you said, oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
well,
No, go ahead.
keep in mind that there were a string of Republican governors that ended in 2010.
Hmm.
So Don Kucheri completed his 8th year of being governor at the end of his term when Lincoln Chafee became the governor, right? Kucheri couldn't run anymore.
Okay.
So there was close to 20 years of Republican governors and Democrat legislature. So
Hmm.
that at the time, 2014, it was still possible for the right Republican to, and I believe it's still possible today, for a Republican who's positioned correctly to still be successful in a statewide campaign. The challenge is fundraising is extremely difficult. The state party really isn't strong, the Republican Party. And so fundraising is a challenge. You have to be willing and able to self-finance. And more importantly, if you're going to run like you're a Texas Republican, you're going to get your butt kicked, right?
Mm.
So when I talk about positioning, you need somebody who's a Rockefeller Republican, right? You need somebody who's going to be fiscally conservative, socially accepting, that kind of thing, and focused in on the quality of life issues. And I still believe that the right person with the right mix of finances and policy and platform can still make a strong case, particularly when your choices are often a candidate who's really compromised by all the special interests that are out there.
Why can't there be a fiscally conservative Democrat? I know that the party has changed a lot since even JFK, but there was a time where there were disagreements in how the government should be ran economically, but it wasn't the difference between totally disagreeing on the ideology of how a government should be ran. It was capitalism. It was just different ways of taking advantage of the capitalist system. Do you think that a
So,
fiscally conservative Democrat could come about in the state?
so I want to make sure that we're talking about Rhode Island specifically,
Yeah, yeah, we are.
and
Yeah.
not talking about Democrats in other states or
Right.
national
I
politics.
was just using that as
Uh,
like a
yeah,
example in
yeah.
general, just
So,
like
well, in Rhode Island, uh, the challenge is, and it's always dangerous to talk in generalizations, but generally speaking, for most of the Democrat legislative districts, The challenge is that to win your primary, if labor's not behind you, they have a very effective ability to murder you in the primary, so you don't make it to the general election as a candidate. So in Democratic politics, you have to be able to survive your primary. And to do that at the legislative level, labor has an outsized and disproportionate interest and ability to swing elections. They use it expertly, and uh, candidates who fall out of favor with labor often find their political careers cut short. At the state level, labor was able to help Governor McKee hit the finish line and win his race. He probably wouldn't have without labor. He made some serious compromises to get that labor support, which is where my difficulty with the whole thing comes into play. And this is when I talk about special interests. This is what I'm talking about. In Providence, the state took over the schools because the schools have had such a troubled history. And with the state takeover, the state had the ability to take the 120-page teacher's contract and throw it out and start from scratch, which I believe is necessary. If you're going to reform a troubled school district, you have to shake it to its foundation and start all the way again. And while that was a real possibility, McKee chose not to do it, and he was rewarded for not doing it with support by the NEA in particular. So it's where, and I understand that governing is compromise and governing is all this other kind of stuff. But in Rhode Island in particular, it's not really so much compromise as a lot of our Democrat elected officials owe their seats to the special interests, and it compromises a lot of the decision making that they do. It's the only way you can even begin to talk about some of the state laws that get passed that force unfunded mandates down onto the cities and towns. The cities and towns bark like crazy about these things being done to them, but it happens anyway because labor, if they can't get it in their local negotiations with municipalities, just has the General Assembly do it instead. So it's a real challenge, and it's one of our big problems, and it's one of the reason that one of the things that I think Rhode Island needs a governor's line item veto, for example, and I've been an advocate for that for a decade now. This is a tool that 44 states give their governors, but Rhode Island doesn't have one. And anytime 44 states are doing something and you're not, it's usually a pretty good sign that you need to join the club, right?
Right.
But getting that reform done through the legislature will be impossible. And what a lot of people may not understand is that to make a constitutional change, there's only two ways it can happen. One way is the legislature has to pass a bill, which would then put the question on the ballot to the voters to say, hey, should Rhode Island have a governor's line item veto? And that was a 10-year effort that two different speakers squashed year after year after year. The only other way to do it is with a constitutional convention. And that is a question on this year's ballot. Every 10 years, Rhode Island voters are asked, do you think we should have a constitutional convention? And what I would tell everyone who's listening to me today is, yes, we must have a constitutional convention. There are some basic, fundamental things we do in terms of how our government operates that are completely opposite and inferior to the way most other state governments conduct themselves. Lack of a governor's line item veto is a huge one. It's a game changer because right now when the governor writes a budget and sends it to the legislature from that point on is going to pass whatever they want. They could throw the governor's budget out, and they often do, and they create their own budget, and then they vote to pass it, and the only thing the governor can do is sign it. There's no check and balance on the legislature's ability to put whatever they want into the budget. That should change because most states don't do things that way. We should have an inspector general. The whole mess with the bridge, the contracting for the bridge,
Hmm.
the assessment and determination of what went wrong. How is it possible that the Department of Transportation was taken by surprise by the degradation of a bridge to the point of failure, right? We're
Right.
not getting the answers. An inspector general, independent of the legislature, independent of the governor, whose job is to provide that accountability, would provide that accountability. So
Okay.
these are reforms that we're not going to get out of the legislature, but we can get from a constitutional convention. Vote
Right.
yes.
Okay. All right. So yeah, I still have a few more questions. I know we're running out of time. So, all right. So let's talk about your research on the 2020 election, and you were hired
Sure.
by the Trump campaign. Can you explain that in as much detail as you can in the limited time we have left?
Yeah. So uh, I did not ask anybody. I didn't apply for, and I didn't advocate to do any work for the Trump campaign in any way. Out of the blue, one of the top campaign lawyers called me on my cell phone. I didn't know who he was. He asked me if I'd help them look for voter fraud. Uh, I told him that uh, I would, and that my company would, but that I didn't expect that we would find what they were looking for. Because I'm expert in this area. I'm a expert in the court systems when it comes to voter data, and I've been looking carefully at it for a decade. I told them we're not likely to find what you want, and I'm not going to tell you what you want to hear. If it's there, I'll find it and it will survive legal scrutiny. If it's not there, I'm going to tell you it's not there. And his answer was, that's exactly what I want you to do. So that began a sprint of 35 days where we were looking at the swing states that everybody knows by heart, looking for deceased voters, looking for voters who voted twice in the swing states and somewhere else. 2 days after we signed the contract, I was also, he began asking me to assess claims of voter fraud that were being made by thousands of people all over the country, to see whether they were true or not, because there were lawyers who wanted to bring those claims to court. And so we began assessing 20 different claims over the month that we were doing our work. The reason it was so compressed, the time frame was so compressed, the only window you have of any kind to contest an election result in the United States is from election night until the day each state certifies the election results. The state certifies the election results, which is typically done by the first week of December. There is no legal or constitutional mechanism to contest the election after that. So everything you do has to be done within that window. Pressure on anybody who's taken a look at it. Nobody ever had done a national look at the results of an election with a viewpoint of trying to bring it to court in the 30 days after an election. It's a stupendously difficult and challenging problem. We took it on. It was very expensive. I was worried about getting paid, and the solution to that was they wired the money that I needed every day in advance before we did any work. We found nothing of note. We did find some dead voters. We did did find some duplicate voters. Not enough to matter in any of the swing states. And even if we had found, let's say, 15,000 fraudulent votes in Georgia, when the margin of victory was less than 12,000 votes, right? That if you find 15,000 fraudulent votes, well, boy, that could be a real problem. No court was going to overturn the election result because nobody could document, of those 15,000 fraudulent votes, you can't prove who those votes went to because we vote anonymously. So the whole focus on fraud and using fraud as a reason to overturn an election result, you can't prove that the fraudulent votes in the case of 2020 were committed by Democrats and the votes went to Biden, right? That's an impossible thing to prove. And in my decade of finding voter fraud, and I probably found 10,000 instances of voter fraud across 3 elections in 24 different states, it's a bipartisan thing. As many Democrats do it as Republicans. So, the basic premise was wrong about voter fraud. All of the claims of voter fraud that we researched, we were able to prove beyond a shadow of a doubt. Every single one of them was false. Our findings were delivered to the campaign on a daily basis. The lawyer I reported to delivered those findings to Mark Meadows, who is Trump's chief of staff. Meadows was deposed by the grand jury in Jack Smith's legal matter in D.C., and he told them that he took the no findings statement directly into the Oval Office. So from me through the campaign to the Oval Office, and another company they hired who had the same net zero findings that mine did, there was overwhelming expert opinion that there wasn't enough fraud to explain any of the losses in any of the states. As a thank you for doing that work, I was subpoenaed by Jack Smith, subpoenaed by Ruby Freeman's legal team in Georgia, and subpoenaed by Fani Willis's prosecutors in Fulton County, Georgia. So so there's been a lot of focus on the documentation and communication that I've had with the Trump campaign. I am on the record under oath and under the pain of perjury that all of my findings were accurate and true. They are. Not in a million years did I think that the work that I was doing would end up in a courtroom setting and high stakes legal actions like the ones that are out there right now. And if you had asked me 4.5 years ago if I thought finding no voter fraud would be as impactful as it is right now, I would have told you you were out of your mind.
Well, I think we need to have a whole other episode talking about that because I know we're out of time now.
I wrote a whole book about it.
Yes.
So
is that it on poster right behind you?
That is, yeah. It's a disproven. Yeah.
Yes. Go ahead, plug it.
And yeah. So it's a book called Disproven. I wrote it because I wanted to make sure with I'm okay if we run over a few minutes.
Okay.
With my, by the way, and it turns out that the lawyer I reported to was also subpoenaed by the January 6th committee. And he did identify my company to the January 6th committee, and some of my materials are in front of the January 6th committee. So I realized that other people were eventually going to tell the story of the work that I did, and they were going to put their own spin on it, whether it was the January 6th committee or Jack Smith's prosecutors or Ruby or Fani Willis's prosecutors. So I started to write the book because the materials were already in the public sphere in terms of having been subpoenaed in court matters. And I wanted to describe without spin what I was asked to do, what we found, what we didn't find, why, careful explanations about all the different fraud claims that were brought to my attention, a careful explanation of why Trump lost 2020, and that there is a valid, rational, multi-point explanation for it. So my explanation for it is matched by Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger's explanation in Georgia, which is matched by Trump's own pollster's explanation, which he published in a report to Trump in December of 2020. And in a nutshell, moderate Republicans abandoned the president. And in some cases, the president told moderate Republicans to take a hike, and they did. And there's not tens of millions of moderate Republicans, but there are enough moderate Republicans in a race where in a state the size of Georgia, where the margin of victory is 12,000, if 100,000 moderate Republicans don't give Trump their vote, and they didn't, that's why he lost. And the same explanation and the same circumstances are in Arizona and Wisconsin. So it's a challenge for Trump even in this election. It's going to be whisker close again, and he's still he has a Nikki Haley voter problem. In Pennsylvania, 150,000 voters in the primary voted for Haley instead of Trump, and she had dropped out of the race. Those voters are not Trump
Even though
voters.
she endorsed him.
Yes. Uh, 250,000 Haley voters in North Carolina, 70,000 Haley voters in Georgia, 300 Haley voters in Michigan.
So do you think they're
Michigan's
gonna
out of,
not vote or
well,
vote?
if they don't vote for Trump, that's pretty harmful. If they vote for Harris instead, that's essentially a 2 point swing, right?
Right.
So, and I believe a lot of them are going to vote for Harris. So,
Really?
and it's because we've had the historical what happened in 2020, and the fact that Trump really hasn't even tried to make a case. So that's the middle part of the book, and it's really important information. Raffensperger wrote the forward for my book, and he describes his findings in the forward. And Fabrizio, the pollster, was my pollster in 2014, interestingly. He's been Trump's pollster all the way, and he has a report that got leaked to Politico. And if you Google Fabrizio and Politico, you'll find his December 2020 report, which lays it out in brutal detail and identifies the fact that Republicans who abandoned Trump cost him the election.
Hmm.
And then the last part of the book, which is the most important part for me, is the things that we can and should do to make elections better in this country. We really, and there's no way to go through this quickly, but we have a system that has evolved over 200 years. Not ever would we design a voting infrastructure today that looks anything like what we've grown into over the last 200 years. And I make the case for wholesale change to how we conduct our elections, the rules that underpin it. Our tolerance for things like gerrymandering is outrageous. Our elections are rigged by gerrymandering, right? And it turns out that 80% of congressional seats, because of gerrymandering, we know what party is going to win those seats, regardless of the candidate who runs. And that gets us more partisan lawmaking as a result, because if you don't have to run a contested election, you're going to get more extreme people who run for and win those seats over time. So everything from the rules and regulations that underpin how we conduct our elections, the differences in how states administer their elections is wild. If you vote early and then die before the election, whether or not your vote counts depends literally on where you lived before you died. In some states, they allow the vote. In other states, they don't allow the vote. And in about a third of the states, there's no rule about it whatsoever. So whatever the state does with those votes is illegal, right? So it's a legal mess. It's a technological mess. There are a great many things that we should do technologically, dealing with voter registration, dealing with the rules that underpin how we conduct our elections. They're really necessary. And in private conversations with secretaries of state who are Democrat and Republican, they all agree with the things that I'm talking about. They know that these are the right things to do. And we need to have a serious grown-up conversation about improving our elections. But we can't do it in the current environment, specifically with an ongoing presidential election where the integrity of the election is being called into question without any merit or basis whatsoever. So, yeah, I am the on-the-ground guy who was responsible for informing the Trump campaign about what, if any, fraud there was, and I was their legal due diligence on every single fraud claim that came through the campaign apparatus. And when I talk about the campaign lawyers I was working with, this wasn't Rudy Giuliani and Sidney Powell and John Eastman. These were young professional paid campaign attorneys who were doing their professional due diligence. And those attorneys were at war with the other attorneys that I had mentioned earlier. And there was a tremendous tension going on within the White House infrastructure, within the campaign infrastructure, even within congressional infrastructure. There were a lot of Republicans who were trying to tamp down the false claims about fraud. They were trying to inject rational, logical, sane behavior, and they were unsuccessful to do so. But Jack Smith's last week released a 165-page legal document in his case. I would encourage everyone to read it because it was written to tell a story, and the story it tells is this tension. And there were a lot of Republicans in high positions who were trying to do the right thing, which heartens me a lot. Look, I wanted to be able to find massive voter fraud. If it was there, I wanted to be the guy to find it, right? I mean, it would have been a hell of a story to tell my grandkids. It simply wasn't there. And the foundation of the whole thing wasn't, oh my gosh, we found all this fraud, therefore let's talk about it. Instead, it was, we think there's fraud, and then everyone's running around like crazy trying to find the evidence to back that up. And it has been a backwards exercise from day one, and it's been unsuccessful. The no claim of fraud has been substantive and accurate.
Okay, yeah. Well, like I said, we could definitely do a whole other podcast just about your book and what you've done. So, Ken, I want to respect your time, and I really, really appreciate you coming on. I hope my questions have made it worthwhile coming on. I've certainly enjoyed talking to you. But
Happy
before
to do
we
it.
end, I just have one last question, and I end every podcast with this: is if you could leave one piece of advice to the listener, what piece of advice would that be?
Yeah. Okay. Well, I'm going to keep it topical. And that piece of advice is there is all manner of information flying at you from every conceivable angle. You get information coming at you on the news. You get information coming at you in print, on the radio, on the different social media that you pay attention to, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We live in a world right now, whether you're consuming information on TikTok, on Instagram, on your favorite TV show. And unfortunately, a lot of that information is coming not just with a bias, but oftentimes it's coming at you without a shred of accuracy or truth behind it. And trying to understand and put your head around true statements versus false statements is time consuming and draining and very difficult to do. But you need to have a critical ear, and you shouldn't take at face value any unsubstantiated claims that of anything. You should always want to be able to see the proof of whatever nugget of truth someone's trying to convince you is actually true. It's critically important, and we're living in a time and a place where truth is somewhat malleable right now, which is ridiculous, right? To even say that is kind of a ridiculous thing to say. But the fact of the matter is that a lot of statements are getting made right now, and there's no truth behind them. So instead of just parroting the truth, try to have an open mind and try to do some amount of research to understand what's real and what's not. Because we can't have an ongoing society where half the people believe that the color of the sky is pink and the other half believe that the color of the sky is black. We need to do better than that, and there are hardcore basic truths, and we have to get back to accepting what those are.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much, Ken. That's great advice. And thank you all for tuning in to the Knowledge is Power podcast. And I'll catch you in the next one. Thanks.
Thanks.
Thanks for tuning in to today's episode. Please leave us a review. It will help us reach more people. I hope you enjoyed it. Thank you, guys. Also, if you're watching on YouTube, be sure to like and subscribe. Also, comment.